I'd like to talk about vaccine financing. There are obviously many other important questions about R&D and pandemics on diagnostics, therapeutics, non-pharmaceutical interventions. But the area that I've been working on is vaccines, so we'll present that. And as Jim indicated, I've been working on this for a while. So rather than just present one paper, I thought I'd try to discuss a few different papers. And I'll do it a bit sequentially.
Okay.
Start by talking about some work prior to the COVID-19 pandemic on ways to incentivize R&D on vaccines. Then talk about the work that we did early in the pandemic when we just had candidate vaccines and we didn't know if any of them would work. Then talk about things after vaccine approval. And finally, I'll conclude by talking about some research on preparing for future pandemics. Okay. Rachel Glenister and I laid out the idea for a technique called advanced market commitments in our book, Strong Medicine. And we propose that donors commit in advance to help finance the purchases of vaccines if they're developed, and if they pass certain technical standards, and if countries agree to effectively pay a copay for this. And that type of commitment can both provide an incentive for the development of vaccines and ensure that if vaccines are developed, that they'll be able to reach people. And our book focused on malaria and HIV, so we were thinking about target vaccines that are needed for very low. HIV obviously affects both high and low income countries, but overwhelmingly the cases are in low income countries. So these are cases where you really have to worry about access. I was partly based on this work, was asked to join a working group at the Center for Global Development to think about how can we move from sort of the abstract idea, the academic idea, to something that could actually be implemented. And the desire, a lot of on the political side, although we had focused on sort of long-run targets, people wanted a quicker win, and so we recommended both going for a short run and a longer run target. Now, what was wound up being funded by a group of donors was a $1.5 billion commitment for a vaccine against the strains of pneumococcus, which are common in low and middle income countries. So there were already vaccines against pneumococcus for the strains common in high income countries, but more work needed to be done to develop a vaccine against the strains in low income countries. And this was formally launched in 2009. 2 vaccines were developed, and now we have a third. And 200 million children have been vaccinated, and it's estimated that 700,000 lives have been saved. And we actually, with Chris and with Chris Snyder and John Levin, we actually happened to, just before the pandemic, write a retrospective on what was the evidence on this. And it looked like there was much faster rollout to low-income countries than normal. It normally can take a decade for things to diffuse from high-income countries to low-income countries for new vaccines. This moved much more quickly. We argued that we learned something from this experience, that it probably made sense to tie advanced market commitment funds more closely to capacity commitments to get large-scale capacity out there, and probably to bring down the country co-payments. And we argued that it made sense to try advanced market commitments more broadly, including for more technologically distant targets. So early in the pandemic, before the vaccines, when we just had candidate vaccines, very early on, I was contacted by the Council of Economic Advisors, and they were interested in, could we use this approach for COVID? And formed a group of economists that we called the Accelerating Health Technologies Group to help think about this request. And that included a number of NBER affiliates: Susan Athey, Eric Budish, Scott Commoners, Christopher Snyder, who was very involved in the first AMC. And we tried to think through some of the issues. One of our early starting points was the immense losses due to COVID-19 creates a huge premium for speed. So we're losing, just in short-run GDP costs alone, 500 billion globally from COVID-19. And the full losses are much, much larger. So Cutlers and Summers estimate just for the US alone, it's $890 billion per month. And while vaccine investment is difficult and expensive, the costs of that pale in comparison to the cost of the economy of COVID and obviously to our health and lives. So let me give a little bit of background on vaccine production. So most vaccine candidates fail. There's multiple different platforms, technological approaches. Firms tend to be specialized in these, and even countries tend to be specialized. The US was the very advanced mRNA vaccines. China had specialization in sort of much more standard production. There's a saying in the industry that the process is the product for vaccines. So it's very different than small molecules, than drugs. Somebody can, if you know the formula, you can create a generic. I don't want to claim it's easy, but it's not, I can't do it, but there are firms that specialize in it and can do it. Vaccines are very different. What the regulatory authorities approve is not, a molecule or something like that. It's actually the process. It's the individual factory. And every step you need to develop special testing procedures for each step in the process and get those approved. So it's a very complicated process. Intellectual property doesn't play the same role that it does in drugs. It also takes a lot of time to build out capacity. You can't put together a factory overnight. And there are questions about capacity constraints. A lot of people would argue there's no way you can speed up this process. You can't get that much new capacity there. Economists tend to think that maybe if you throw enough money at something, if you create big enough incentives, that we can get more production. And that was the attitude of our team. And I think but clearly there's also something to the pure engineering perspective that there are limits to that. Probably much more elasticity in the long run. Okay, typical processes, this takes 3 to 4 years. Of course, even after things have approved and the capacity is there, there's a risk of production delays. There's a risk you find side effects. It's a very tricky business to be in. So one thing that we really emphasize is that the commercial incentives to install early before the trials have been done, that's a very risky thing to do, and to install at the sufficient scale are much less than the social value. So we estimated this was a more recent estimate, we estimate the marginal social value of additional vaccine capacity, at thousands of dollars per course per annual course of production, annual course that you can produce. But in a pandemic, there are social constraints. There's on profiteering, think of these as ethical constraints. Some firms said they're doing this nonprofit basis, but there's also just sort of political and legal constraints. So the current prices range from $6 to $40 per course of vaccine. And that creates a case, that huge gap between the private incentives and the social value creates a case for public support for early and large-scale capacity installation. So, we did put together, pretty crude, but nonetheless a model to try and think about what type of investment makes sense. And the results from that suggest that it makes sense to invest in a wide portfolio of candidates, so you have many shots of goal. We actually took our figures from the historical success rate of vaccines. I would argue we've actually been incredibly lucky. We've had a much higher success rate than with COVID, thank goodness. But we took our figures from the historical success rate. So then you want many different shots on goal, many different possible vaccine candidates, and diversify the type of candidates across these different platforms. Okay? It makes sense to invest in very large scale capacity as well, if you can even do that. Maybe you run into supply constraints, but governments should try to invest. This should be done in parallel with trials rather than waiting for the trials to be done. It makes sense, we did this calculation for the US, but then it's very easy to do it for other countries as well. And a striking finding is this didn't just make sense for the US or Europe, it makes sense for the middle income countries in Latin America, and even for low income countries to invest, although at different scales. So for the US, it's optimal to try a whole bunch of different candidates, even pretty low probability ones, and to build out a lot of capacity. For a low income country, they can only afford to take to invest or at risk in the most likely candidates and the ones that are more affordable. Okay, let me mention that the finding that very different scales of investment. So if we, again, I'm looking at this from just a straight economics perspective, from the standpoint of national interest, when I say that the different investment levels for different countries. But I think that has implications for incentive compatibility and what sort of global system we set up. So some of the early proposals for COVAX, the global effort on vaccines, were, they would say, look, they had a lot of emphasis on equity. The low-income countries are going to get it at the same rate as the high-income countries, and they're going to, and they actually put in provisions that if you were a high-income country and you bought on your own, then you would have to you wouldn't get your allocation from COVAX. But they were looking for financing from high-income countries. And I think one of the lessons is, I wish people took a more global perspective on this, but I think we have to be realistic. I don't think this is just, the politicians you think of as most nationalistic. A democratically elected politician is going to have very strong incentives when they're losing 7% of GDP and hundreds of thousands of lives to focus on their domestic population. I'll come back later to implications for the international system and how we can organize things perhaps better for next time. But our analysis suggested it would be very hard to make that sort of very strong restriction on what high-income countries can do, make that actually work. And that it's probably better to structure things to ask for financial contributions from high-income countries, but not ask them to restrict their vaccine use. Okay, there are also a lot of implications for contract design. So actually, somewhat in contrast to the advanced market commitment idea, what's done for COVID is also called an advanced market commitment. And there's some aspects of that idea that have been used, that are being used for COVID. But we recommended something that was a bit different. The advanced market commitment, the original one for pneumococcus, the rewards were you only got paid if you produced a successful vaccine. For pneumococcus, because happy to discuss this more later, but it looked like the optimal design was to have still some combination of push and pull, but rely much more on push, i.e. an upfront funding. And that had to do with the great, relatively easier to observe capacity installation costs and relatively difficult to observe probability of success, together with the fact that you want many shots on goal. You don't just want to fund the best candidate. We argued that it makes sense to include explicit provisions on capacity, broadly defined, not just the equipment, but the quality control capacity, the human capacity, et cetera, in the contracts. If you think about hiring a contractor for your home, you know that they may be late, and that's, and that once you're in the contract, it's hard to do anything about it. I don't think you'll get to perfectly solve that problem, but at a minimum, you should include some milestones for capacity, putting capacity in place. I would say construction, it's often repurposing. Also, we argued that it was important to invest in supply chains. And again, there are multiple reasons for this, double marginalization and so on. But I think the biggest one is that the market signals that are not going to pass through appropriately during the pandemic, when there are restrictions on really raising your prices when something's in shortage. And that means that you could have a situation where you offer to buy the end product, but then the vaccine manufacturers can't get the inputs they use, even if hypothetically it would be worth it from a social point of view to construct new factories or to produce the intermediate goods. But those would only be profitable if they were amortized over a very long period of time, and there's a risk that that wouldn't be the case. So it makes sense to directly finance the supply chain capacity. Okay, let me say a little bit about mid-pandemic, after vaccines were approved. I'll skip this slide. Oh gosh, I'm over skipping that slide. Let me just tell you what we found. Okay, sorry, I'll keep this, sorry, I won't go over this slide. Look, we said, what's the value of an additional 1 billion courses of annual capacity? You could also think of this as, what's the value of additional capacity, of an additional unit of annual capacity? And you can see this varies a lot according to the scenario. But it's much more valuable if we got this in April than if we got this in July. This is from an article that came out in Science. But it's still very valuable, even if you brought this capacity online by July. If you think that there's 4 billion doses of capacity already, and it could be less, that varies every day depending on what's happening with production problems and side effects. But it's still worth $257 per unit of annual capacity. And one other thing I would note is that the benefits of more capacity, I've argued from an efficiency point of view that we want more capacity. It's also great from an equity point of view. Basically, what you're doing is you're shortening the queue. So if you think that it's going to be 2 years till the world's vaccinated and you double production, then it's 1 year. For somebody at the front of the queue, that doesn't make much difference. For somebody at the back of the queue, that makes a big difference. So we see that this would speed up vaccination in this example only by half a month for the low-income country, for the high-income countries, but for 2.5 months for the world. And that's and you might think, is it really worth spending a lot of money for that? Well, the answer is yes, because every month makes such a big difference. Even though these are, you might have to spend billions on vaccine capacity, but that's worth it when the world's losing 500 billion a month. Okay. Okay. Now that said, it's now getting later and later, and given the lag times, this is getting harder and harder. We would still support more capacity. There is questions of how much more capacity is even out there. But the current work we're doing suggests that there may be very big gains from another strategy, which is finding ways to use existing capacity more efficiently. And we've seen that some with first doses, increasing the policies, increasing the spacing between doses. The UK has done that. The original tests were done with 3 weeks. They're doing 3 months. That looks like it's been very successful. Part of our paper talks about those strategies, but I'm going to suggest something beyond that, or at least exploring something beyond that. There's a lot of uncertainty around the optimal regimen and optimal dose. Normally you're looking for the thing that benefits the individual patient, this is a circumstance with shortages, and in shortages, the socially optimal dose might be much less than the individually optimal dose. add to that we don't really know. They were moving very quickly. They don't test every possible, there's some pre-testing, but it's very limited, particularly in these circumstances. We don't really know what the right dose is. Brazil used 1/5 doses to stop a yellow fever epidemic in 2018 with recommendations from the World Health Organization. And there's some evidence that could work for COVID-19. The first dose, there's actually, there's a famous mistake with AstraZeneca where they accidentally gave a half dose that, it's a bit confounded with some other factors, so it's not clear, but there's reason it looked just as effective. With Pfizer and Moderna, there's also some evidence for this. Not that it will work, but that it might work. Okay. We put together a standard epidemiological model and looked at the impact of fractional dosing. So the top row in red shows what the impact would be if you didn't lose anything relative to a full dose with 95% efficacy. And you could see if you could double the number of, if you get 2 doses for every dose, you roughly cut in half the number of deaths if there's no loss in efficacy, which is a potential scenario. But let me note that for small efficacy losses, even a small increase in vaccination speed makes this beneficial. So let's say, let me actually just focus on half doses. So if you had a half dose and you could double the number of doses because you're only using half as much substance, then that would, let's say that reduced efficacy to 80%. Then what you would be doing is you'd save roughly 1/4 of the lives that we're losing to the epidemic. And you'd have a much bigger impact on infections. The infection impact is bigger than the death impact. Now, a half dose would produce gains unless the efficacy is below 70%. A 1/4 dose would produce gains unless the efficacy falls below 50%. What we would take from that is that it's worth experimenting. So there's huge option value of testing fractional dosing. And you could do adaptive testing. You could start by just examining the immune response. Do you get the immune response? Some of that's been done already and looks positive, but you don't need a full-scale phase 3 trial. You could embed this in vaccine rollout, so you wouldn't need to delay delivery. There's low risk because the safety is already tested. In fact, to the extent that there's concern about side effects, you'll probably, you'll move that down a little bit. There's actually a trial, we just found out a couple of days ago, that a trial started in Belgium, but I think we would want to try this with multiple vaccines, multiple different regimens, half dose, 1/4 dose, 3/4 dose, different doses, half dose for the first or the second, and try this against multiple variants. The potential of this is you could dramatically speed up the timeline of the world being vaccinated with huge benefits for health and huge benefits for the economy and the social outcomes more generally. The private incentives for this testing are much less than the social value, because even if a firm could cut the dose in half and charge the same amount for each half dose, the social value, the private value of selling a dose is much, much less than the social value. I also note that the national value of this is much less than the global value. So even from an individual country basis, no country has sufficient incentives to do it. That said, talking to experts, I think this could be done quite inexpensively. And so, I think it's actually realistically possible to try this. So that in some ways, that would be my top, trying to do some testing of this would be top policy recommendation for dealing with COVID right now. Okay, on preparing for future pandemics. One bit of this is so I've been a member of a G20 panel, which is advising the G20, which the G20 asked Ngozi and Larry Summers and a former Singapore finance minister to chair. And they're trying to make proposals to the G20 on pandemic preparedness, which again is much, much wider than vaccines. But I think some of the lessons from our analysis are relevant. During a pandemic, you need to really rapidly expand capacity for many different candidates. And that requires a lot of different inputs. So I think it's important to keep stockpiles on hand and standby capacity on hand for production of vaccines and for production of the intermediate goods. I don't think you can expect firms to do this just based on private incentives, because they're going to expect limits on pricing during a pandemic. So there's a sort of straightforward case for governments helping cover the costs of maintaining the standby capacity and stockpiles. But I'd argue that there's another case which is more subtle. And that relates to maintaining the international trade system during pandemics. You know, no country, not even the US, should rely entirely on domestic candidates in the supply chain. You know, right now, Pfizer, that's relying on a German-developed partnership between Pfizer and a German firm. But more broadly, we really need to keep international trade during a pandemic going. You know, maybe the US could sort of manage. We wouldn't have the full spectrum of technologies available to us. Things could have turned out very differently. Instead of so many vaccine candidates, so many different platforms succeeding, could have been the Chinese vaccine worked and ours didn't, or vice versa. You want access to the globe, and that's for the US. If you think about, you know, France, Italy, Australia, Canada, Peru, Zambia, it's clear most countries are going to rely on that. But when they're shorter, if there's a shortage, you know, everything we know about, you know, principles of economics in the third week of the semester, you know, if you put on price controls, a whole bunch of things start happening. And one of them will be the true value of these vaccines are immense in a pandemic. Countries are going to be tempted to put on export restrictions, and we've seen that, and to hoard vaccines, which some people argue the US is doing right now. It's going to be very difficult to address that through moral persuasion. That was sort of the incentive compatibility point I was making earlier. So we need to think about this as a game and think about how we change countries' incentives. And I think the best way to change their incentives is to build up the stockpiles and standby capacity. And then the incentives to impose the export restrictions and to hoard vaccines will be much weaker. If you don't do that, then countries are going to question whether they're going to be able to get access to vaccines during pandemics. They're all going to try to go it alone. We still won't have enough capacity with that, and likely we'll get a bunch of export restrictions, efforts to hoard vaccines, with which would be a extremely both inefficient and inequitable outcome. You know, we need both national efforts to try to have these stockpiles and standby capacity, but I also think there's an important role for global efforts, not just for the low-income countries, but also so that we can avoid the collapse of the international trading system. Thanks very much.